So coming now into some of the nuts and bolts of functional breathing, the basics of breathing and breathing mechanics. So as you'll be well aware, we have two phases to the breath. We have the pause at the top and the pause at the bottom, but primarily we have these two main phases, the inhalation and the exhalation, or inspiration and expiration. So as we move through this with the inhale, when the lungs inhale, when we inhale, the diaphragm contracts and it starts to pull downwards. What happens with that is that the size of the thoracic cavity increases, and that decreases the pressure inside. And so the air moves from outside of the body into the lungs, and vice versa on the exhale. So the diaphragm relaxes, the lungs contract, and the air is pushed out. What's interesting as well, actually, so mammals are actually unique in having a diaphragm. So mammals, compared to a lot of the animal kingdom as well, are unique in having a diaphragm, meaning that we have an active inhale. So we actively have to pull the air in, but we have a passive exhale. Whereas actually for most other beings, it's the inverse. So we're unique as mammals in that way. So for some reason, it's done me again, and it's taken me forward one. So we'll come back. I like to give the bad news before the good news. So we're going to look first at dysfunctional breathing. So we're now into the realms of functional versus dysfunctional. So starting to think about how you are breathing. And as we move through this, you may start to identify some things in how you breathe in given moments throughout the day, when you're working, when you're exercising, whatever it might be. And this is not, really importantly, this is not to panic anybody. This is, as I said, this isn't to scare anybody into thinking, oh my God, I have such awful breathing habits, but it's just to plant a seed to make us think a little bit more about how we breathe moment to moment. So some of the telltale signs of dysfunctional breathing, and dysfunctional breathing, as you can see here, describes breathing in any way that isn't optimal for our physical, mental, and emotional health. So upper chest breathing, shallow breathing, mouth breathing. If anyone's ever heard the kind of old-fashioned English insult of someone being a mouth breather, there's good reason for that being an insult that we'll come on to in a second. Over breathing, so hyperventilation, breathing beyond your body's requirements, frequent sighing, frequent yawning, excessive breathlessness, so getting out of breath really very easily. And then these next three, dry mouth, brain fog, and fatigue, those are signs of dysfunctional breathing during waking time, but they are really quite explicit signs of dysfunctional breathing during sleep. So if you wake up with a dry mouth, if you wake up with brain fog, speaking of, or fatigue, then it's very, very likely that you are mouth breathing or over breathing during sleep. So if that is anybody, it was me for a very long time. We'll come back to that towards the end as to what you can do about that. But those are just some of the signs that you can start to look for in yourself, but also start to look for in clients and people that you know. I used to live with one of the most noisy mouth breathers of all time, and I never realized until I started this work quite how much damage it was doing to him. And I've since fixed him. So let's move on to functional breathing. So functional breathing is relatively simple when it comes down to sort of the basics. The acronym that we use, and this has nothing to do with psychedelics, is LSD. So LSD breathing, light, slow, and deep. And this chap on the right is looking at his nose. So nasal breathing, light, slow, and deep. So I'm going to work through each of these one by one, just so we can get a feel for why. So we'll start with light. So the question that I often get at this point is, how can I breathe lightly and deeply at the same time? They seem kind of, what's the word? They seem to contradict each other. So the reason that we want light breathing is that we want to balance our blood biochemistry. So all breathing is a gas exchange. We are mostly looking to inhale oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. When we So we'll come into this in more depth in a second, but light breathing is the most efficient way to balance the levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide in our system. The reason with which we need to do that is that for the majority of us, we overbreathe. So to come back to overbreathing as a symptom of dysfunctional breathing, overbreathing means that we are breathing beyond our body's requirements, our metabolic requirements. What that typically looks like is that we are exhaling too much carbon dioxide from our system. So we do want to exhale carbon dioxide, but we need to maintain a certain level of CO2 in our system in order to release oxygen from our red blood cells into our tissues. So carbon dioxide actually creates the situation, the environment, the circumstances with which oxygen can be released into our tissues, our muscles, and into our brain. And so light breathing encourages us to tolerate higher levels of carbon dioxide, which in turn allows us to more efficiently oxygenate our bodies. So it's kind of this dance and this balance between exhaling CO2, but not too much that we're not able to get that release of oxygen efficiently into our tissues and our cells. So the reason that I'll come to deep breathing next, because there is that slight contradiction. I think there's a bit of a myth that for many of us, when we were growing up, we got taught that when you're feeling anxious, when you're panicking, you should take a deep breath, which is good advice, except the demo of that breath was always usually through the mouth, usually upper chest, and usually a very aggressive breath. So it'd be someone going, that is going to create panic. That's going to create stimulation in the nervous system. A deep breath is simply using your diaphragm, breathing down into the lower capacity of your lungs, using your full respiratory capacity. That can still be gentle. That can still be light. And so that is a really key practice as part of functional breathing work, is light, deep, and then as a result, naturally slow down into the belly. The reason slow breathing is just kind of, what's the right word? Magic seems like a bit of a cop out, but it's a very, very good thing for both balancing our blood biochemistry, but also regulating our nervous system. So slow breathing and belly breathing are great for a state of calm, balance, and peace within the nervous system. So the lower your respiratory rate, the better throughout the day. For anybody who has a wearable of any kind, they will usually tell you your respiratory rate. And again, that's something to start paying attention to. A lot of people obviously started paying attention to it during COVID. People would see kind of a big spike in respiratory rate over a couple of days, and that would be a telltale sign that COVID was there, basically. The average adult's respiratory rate sits somewhere between 12 and 18 breaths per minute. So the average is somewhere between those two. The lower, the better. You know, there are, they've done studies on monks and seasoned meditators who at points in their prolonged meditation sessions can get down to 3, 2, sometimes even 1 breath per minute. And that's a combination of obviously a deep meditative state and also a high tolerance to carbon dioxide, which is something we will come onto in a little bit more depth later on. So we're now going to look at the conversation around functional breathing, which splits into 2 halves: mouth versus nose, belly versus chest. Very, very simple, pretty straightforward stuff. On this side, the mouth versus nose, as I was going to say the old adage goes, but maybe this is just a breathwork thing. Noses are for breathing, mouths are for eating. If you remember nothing else, always try and breathe through your nose. That applies to sleep, that applies to low intensity to medium intensity exercise, that applies to while you're sat at your desk, that applies to while you're watching television. Just breathe through your nose. The reason for that, naturally slows the breath down, and we know why slow breathing is good. It warms and humidifies the air and filters unwanted particles from the air. Both of those two just mean that the nose is preparing the air that's being inhaled, filtering and cleaning it, and getting it in the best possible state for our lungs to be received by the lungs. And the fourth and final kind of lesser known part of this is that it also releases nasal nitric oxide. So nasal nitric oxide, when we breathe through the nose, nitric oxide starts to pool in our nasal cavity and our sinus cavities. And then when we inhale, we pull that nitric oxide into our system, into our blood flow. Nitric oxide has been shown to significantly lower blood pressure and improve circulation. Again, both good things. So we don't get that when we breathe through the mouth. So mouth breathing, we talked a little bit about over breathing already, that dumping out of too much CO2 from the system. Mouth breathing is a great way to do that because it's a bigger vessel. It also stimulates our stress response in the nervous system, brain fog, fatigue, dry mouth, bad breath. And even in children who are chronic mouth breathers, it changes the structural development of their face. So that's something also to be aware of. The other one that I skipped out there intentionally was dehydration. So nasal breathing has actually been shown to reduce dehydration by about 42%. So we lose 42% more water when we mouth breathe. And for anyone who's ever experienced significant dehydration, again, we know why that is not good for us. I'm gonna talk here about sleep and mouth breathing. So it's not something I normally include in presentations, but it's something that I normally spend a large chunk of the questions speaking about, because I, at this point, normally tell people that I sleep with tape across my mouth. And for anybody who hasn't heard of that before, it usually gets some fairly confused looks. The tape across the mouth is to stimulate nasal breathing. So if you are someone who wakes up with that dry mouth, with fatigue, with brain fog, it's a great way to retrain yourself and retrain your body to breathe through the nose while you sleep. And that is really the foundational, fundamental piece of why we do that. The reason for it really is that you could be practicing your functional breathing and breathing perfectly for 16 hours of the day. If you then go to bed, sleep for 8 hours with your mouth wide open, over breathing, you're going to be undoing all of the hard work that you put in through the day, and you will go 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps back, and you'll be making minor gains instead of strides forward. So it's strange, I'm well aware. But I would really encourage anybody who thinks that they might be prone to mouth breathing during sleep to check it out, at least give it a try. And I will answer any questions on that at the end. But it's been a bit of a revelation for me personally, and for lots of other people. It's a very quick, low-hanging piece of fruit that we can make inroads on.